Communisation and the Value Form Theory, from Endnotes, issue number 2. Introduction. Quote, "The value form of the product of labor is the most abstract, but also the most universal form of the bourgeois mode of production. By that fact, it stamps the bourgeois mode of production as a particular kind of social production of a historical and transitory character." End quote, from Marx's Capital Volume 1. In Endnotes number 1, we describe the emergence of the theory of communization in France in the early years following May 1968. The following text, and others in this issue, operate within this perspective of communization, but they also draw heavily upon theoretical developments in the area of Marxian value form theory, and in particular, upon the tendency of systematic dialectic, which has emerged in recent years. Marx was clear that what distinguished his approach and what made it a critique, rather than a continuation of political economy, was his analysis of the form of value. In his celebrated exposition of the fetish character of the commodity and its secret, he writes, quote, "Political economy has indeed analyzed value in its magnitude, however incompletely, and has uncovered the content concealed within this form, but it has never once asked the question of why this content has assumed that particular form, that is to say, why labor is expressed in value, and why the measurement of labor by its duration is expressed in the magnitude of the value of the product. These forms, which bear the unmistakable stamp of belonging to a social formation in which the process of production has mastery over man, instead of the opposite, appear to the political economist's bourgeois consciousness to be as much a self-evident and nature-imposed necessity as productive labor itself." End quote from Capital Volume 1. Despite such statements by Marx, the connection between the value form and fetishism, the inversion where humans are dominated by the results of their own activity, did not play much role in the interpretation of Capital until the 1960s. Instead, accounts of Marx's economics emphasize the apparently simple argument in the first two sections of Chapter 1 of Capital, where labor is identified as lying behind the value of commodities. The latter two sections of the chapter, on the value form and fetishism, were generally taken as a more or less convoluted way of describing the market, and passed over quickly. Thus, the careful way Marx distinguished his understanding from the classical political economy of Ricardo was not explored. When Marxists insisted on the labor theory of value, they did so in terms of the quantitative issue of the substance and magnitude of value, rather than the qualitative issue of the form of value. Against the neoclassical revolution in bourgeois economics, which repudiated the labor theory of value, Marxists tended to assert the classical position that labor is a substance of value, and that value is the labor embodied in the product. Like the classical political economists, Marxists failed to address the peculiarity of the social process of production that is necessary for such quantitative magnitudes to be compared. That is to say, they too did not ask the question of why labor appears in the value form of its product, and what kind of labor can so appear. Yet as Marx indicates, it is only by understanding the intricacy of the value form that one can understand the subsequent forms of money and capital, or how human activity takes the form of the accumulation of capital. For Marx, the value form is an expression of the dual character of labor and capitalism, its character as concrete labor appearing in the use value of the commodity, and its character as abstract labor appearing in the value form. Though abstract labor is historically specific to capitalism, the failure to properly distinguish these two aspects of labor means that the value form is taken as an expression of simple natural human labor as such. Labor as a content or substance of value was seen to be physiological labor, something independent of its social form. Here substance is taken to be something that naturally resides in the object. But for Marx, abstract labor and value are more peculiar than that. Value is a relation or process that unfolds itself and maintains itself through different forms. In one moment money, the next the commodities that compose the labor process, including the commodity labor power, the next a commodity product, and then again money, whilst always maintaining a relation in its money form to its commodity form and vice versa. For Marx, then, value is not the embodiment of labor in the commodity, nor an unmoving substance. It is rather the relation or process which dominates those who bear it, a substance that is at the same time subject. Yet in the orthodox Marxist tradition, there was no recognition that abstract labor was a certain socially and historically specific formatting of one part of human activity, implying the conversion of human beings into a resource for the boundless increase of this activity, and as a result, as an end in itself. Understanding value as merely a form imposed by the private ownership of the means of production on a basic, unproblematic content went together with a vision of socialism as a state-directed version of essentially the same industrial division of labor that is organized by the market and capitalism. On this view, labor, which was restricted by market forms under capitalism, would become the conscious organizing principle of society in socialism. A major exception to the traditional Marxist neglect of the value form and fetishism was the Russian economist Isaac Rubin. In path-breaking work in the 1920s, he recognized that, quote, the theory of fetishism is, per se, the basis of Marx's entire economic system, and in particular, of his theory of value, end quote, and that abstract labor as a content of value is not, quote, something to which form adheres from the outside. Rather, through its development, the content itself gives birth to the form which was already latent in the content, end quote. But Rubin's work, suppressed in Russia, remained more or less unknown. For the orthodoxy, Marxist political economy, the fact that bourgeois critics saw Marx as essentially a follower of Ricardo was not contested. Rather, he was defended on exactly this basis, as having correctly tidied up Ricardo's recognition of labor as a content of value, and of labor time as its magnitude, adding only a more or less left Ricardian theory of exploitation. On this view, labor is something that exists quasi-naturalistically in the product, and exploitation is seen as an issue of the distribution of that product. Thus, the solution to capitalism is seen as workers, via the state or other means, shifting that distribution in their favor. If exploitation is a matter of a deduction of a portion of the social product by a parasitic ruling class, then socialism does not have to substantially alter the form of the commodity production, but may simply take it over, eliminate the parasitic class, and distribute the product equitably. A common background. The inclusion of the form and fetishism within the readings of Capital only began to be seriously challenged from the mid-1960s, partly through the rediscovery of Rubin, and a number of approaches that have at one time or another been labeled value form theory. The debates on the subtleties of the value form, on issues of method, on the question of Marx's relation to Hegel and so on, emerged then, at the same moment as the theory of communisation. But value form theory and communisation expressed dissatisfaction with received interpretations of Marx, and thus a rejection of orthodox or traditional Marxism. For us, there is an implicit commonality between value form theory and the theory of communisation, such that each may productively inform the other. We will here examine the historical parallels and points of convergence between these two tendencies. From the middle of the 1960s to the late 70s, capitalism at a world level was characterized by intense class struggles and radical social movements. From the urban uprisings in the USA to insurrectionary strikes in Poland, from student movements and youth revolt to the toppling of elected and unelected governments by workers' unrest. Accepted relations at work were questioned, as was the family, gender, and sexuality, mental health, and humans' relationship to nature, in a general contestation across society. Intertwined with these struggles, the post-war boom ended in a crisis of capitalist accumulation with high inflation and rising unemployment. The revolutionary overcoming of capitalism and its pseudo-alternative in the Eastern countries seemed to many to be on the agenda. The emergence of both a critical Marxism of value form theory and the theory of communization was premised on these struggles and the revolutionary hopes they engendered. Just as these two tendencies were produced in the same moment, they waned simultaneously with the wave of struggles that had produced them. The 70s crisis of accumulation, rather than leading to an intensification of struggles and their development in a revolutionary direction, actually gave rise to a radical capitalist restructuring in which the movements and the revolutionary expectations linked to them were comprehensively defeated. This restructuring led to the relative eclipse of these discussions, just as the discussion of communization in France emerged in the early 70s, only to fade away in the 80s and early 90s, before resurfacing again recently. Contemporary interest in systematic dialectic is in many ways a return to the value-form debates of the 70s, after a period when the discussion has gone relatively quiet. Communization. Quote, "It is not the unity of living and active humanity with the natural, inorganic conditions of their metabolic exchange with nature, and hence their appropriation of nature, which requires explanation or as a result of a historic process, but rather the separation between these inorganic conditions of human existence and this active existence, a separation which is completely posited only in the relation of wage labor and capital." End quote, from Marx's Grundrisse. The theory of communization emerged as a critique of various conceptions of the revolution inherited from both the second and third international Marxism of the workers' movement, as well as its dissident tendencies and oppositions. The experiences of revolutionary failure in the first half of the 20th century seem to present as the essential question whether workers can or should exercise their power through the party and state, Leninism, the Italian communist left, or through organization at the point of production, anarcho-syndicalism, the Dutch-German communist left. On one hand, some would claim that it was the absence of the party, or the right kind of party, that had led to revolutionary chances being missed in Germany, Italy, or Spain, while on the other hand, others could say that it was precisely the party and the statist political conception of the revolution that had failed in Russia and played a negative role elsewhere. Those who developed the theory of communization rejected this posing of revolution in terms of forms of organization, and instead aimed to grasp the revolution in terms of its content. Communization implied a rejection of the view of revolution as an event, where workers take power, followed by a period of transition. Instead, it was to be seen as a movement characterized by immediate communist measures, such as the free distribution of goods, both for their own merit and as a way of destroying the material basis of the counter-revolution. If, after a revolution, the bourgeoisie is expropriated but workers remain workers, producing in separate enterprises, dependent on their relation to that workplace for their subsistence, and exchanging with other enterprises, then whether that exchange is self-organized by the workers or given central direction by a workers' state means very little. The capitalist content remains, and sooner or later the distinct role or function of the capitalist will reassert itself. By contrast, the revolution as a communizing movement will destroy, by ceasing to constitute and reproduce them, all capitalist categories. Exchange, money, commodities, the existence of separate enterprises, the state, and most fundamentally, wage labor and the working class itself. Thus, the theory of communization arose in part from the recognition that opposing the Leninist party state model with a different set of organizational forms, democratic, anti-authoritarian councils, had not got to the root of the matter. In part, this new kind of thinking about revolution arose from the characteristics and forms of the class struggle which came to the fore in this period, such as sabotage, absenteeism, and other forms of refusal of work, and from social movements outside the workplace, all of which could be seen to reject the affirmation of work and of workers' identity as the basis of revolution. A great spur to the development of the notion of communization was the work of the Situationist International, SI, who, with their perspective of a total revolution rooted in the transformation of everyday life, had felt and theorized on new needs being expressed in struggles, and thus were later recognized as best anticipating and expressing the spirit of the 1968 events in France. But the concept of communization was in a sense a product of the struggles and developments of the time. The capacity of the French milieu to give expression to it was inseparable from a return to Marx, and in particular the discovery and diffusion of the unknown Marx of texts such as the Grundrisse and the results of the direct production process, hereafter results. Before these texts became available in the late 60s, the SI and other critics of orthodox Marxism had tended to draw on the early Marx such as the economic and philosophical manuscripts of 1844. Even the case of the SI in the Frankfurt School, where there is also use of a theory of fetishism and reification drawn from Capital, this was mediated through Lukács, and not a product of a detailed appropriation of the 3 volumes of Capital. Thus, a mature critique of political economy as a whole tended to be left in the hands of traditional Marxism. As we have already indicated, the relevance of Marx's description of his work as a critique of political economy, the importance of the value form and of fetishism, were overwhelmingly missed within this positivistic interpretation. The newly available texts, such as the Grundrisse, undermined the traditional readings and allowed the radicality of the mature critique to be recognized. Through their marginal relation to orthodox Marxism, those who identify with left communist critiques of Bolshevism and of what had happened in Russia were in a good position to read the new Marx texts. Very important in the French context was Jacques Commat in the journal Invariance, which first appeared in 1968, as well as expressing an opening up of the heritage of the Bordigist Italian left tradition, both to the experience of the Dutch-German left and to the unfolding struggles of the time. Invariance was a place for a fresh reading of Marx. Commat's one-time collaborator, Roger Dangeville, translated the Grundrisse and the results into French, putting a spanner in the works of the Arthur-Syrian anti-Hegelian interpretation of Marx, dominant in France. In Invariance, Commat published an important commentary on these texts. Commat's text played a similar role for the French post-68 discussions to that played at the same time by Rozdolsky's The Making of Marx's Capital for the discussions that were to follow in Germany. Both rely heavily on quotations to introduce and explore the significance of texts by Marx that were largely unknown at the time. Rozdolsky provides a comprehensive study of the Grundrisse, while Commat's less systematic account draws on other Marxist drafts, in particular the results. While Commat acknowledges the merits of Rozdolsky's book, a difference is that while Rozdolsky ultimately reduces the Grundrisse to merely a preparation for Capital, Commat is more attuned to the way in which it, and the other drafts of Capital, point beyond the understanding Marxists had derived from the latter work. Commat recognizes the different ways Marx introduced and developed the category of value in the various versions of the critique of political economy have a significance beyond a progressive improvement of the presentation. Some of the earlier treatments bring out aspects such as the historical autonomization of value, the definition of capital as value and process, and the importance of the category of subsumption, in ways that are not as clear in the published versions. One finds in Commat's reading of the newly available texts a recognition that the implications of Marx's critique of political economy were far more radical than the positivistic Marxist interpretation of capital had taken them to be. There is a fascinating break from traditional Marxist assumptions in Commat's work, one that is brought out sharply in the contrast between his original commentary from the mid-60s and the notes he added in the early 70s. Thus, while the earlier commentary grapples with the classical Marxist theory of the transition, in the later notes we see the assumptions of this theory overthrown. Thus, Commat concludes his 1972 remarks with a call for communization. Quote, "The near totality of men rising against the totality of capitalist society, the struggle simultaneously against capital and labor, 2 aspects of the same reality, i.e., the proletariat must struggle against its own domination so as to be able to destroy itself as a class, and to destroy capital and classes. Once victory is assured worldwide, the universal class, which is really constituted, formation of the party according to Marx, during a huge process preceding the revolution and the struggle against capital, and which is psychologically transformed and has transformed society, will disappear because it becomes humanity. There are no groups outside it. Communism then develops freely. Lower socialism no longer exists, and the phase of the dictatorship of the proletariat is reduced to the struggle to destroy capitalist society, the power of capital." End quote. For most subsequent theorists of communization, the previously unavailable writings of Marx became basic texts. The translations of the Grundrisse and his now famous Fragment on Machines directly inform Gilles Dauvet's prototypical argument for communization. In this fragment, Marx describes how capital, in its drive to increase surplus labor time, reduces necessary labor time to a minimum through the massive application of science and knowledge to production. This creates a possibility of the appropriation by all of that alienated system of knowledge, allowing the reappropriation of the surplus labor time as disposable time. Communism is thus understood not in terms of a new distribution of the same sort of wealth based on labor time, but is founded on a new form of wealth measured in disposable time. Communism is about nothing less than a new relation to time, or even a different kind of time. For Dauvé, by this focus on time, Marx implies a radical break between capitalism and communism, which, quote, excludes the hypothesis of in a gradual way to communism through the progressive destruction of the law of value, end quote, and thus proves the councilist and democratic alternative to Leninism as itself inadequate. The earlier drafts also pointed towards a more radical concept of revolution at a more fundamental ontological level. The drafts reveal that for Marx, a critique of political economy calls into question the division of subjectivity and objectivity, the giveness of what it is to be an individual, and what is and is not our very being. For Marx, these ontological questions are essentially social. He considered that the political economists had more or less succeeded in clarifying the categories which grasp the social forms of life under capitalism, while the bourgeoisie, however, tended to present these as ahistorical necessities. Marx recognized them as historically specific forms of the relationship between humans, and between humans and nature. The fact that human activity is mediated by social relations between things generates an atomized, object-less character to human subjectivity. The individual experience in capitalism is one of pure subjectivity, and all objectivity exists against it in the form of capital. Quote, separation of property from labor appears as a necessary law of this exchange between capital and labor. Labor posited as not capital as such is, 1. Not objectified labor, conceived negatively, separated from all means and object of labor, from its entire objectivity. This living labor, existing as an abstraction from these moments of its actual reality, also not value, this complete denudation, purely subjective existence of labor, stripped of all objectivity. Labor as absolute poverty, poverty not as shortage, but as total exclusion of objective wealth. 2. Not objectified labor, not value, conceived positively or as a negativity in relation to itself. Labor not as an object, but as activity, not as itself value, but as a living source of value. The in every way mutually contradictory statements that labor is absolute poverty as object, on one side, and is on the other side the general possibility of wealth as subject and as activity, are reciprocally determined and follow from the essence of labor, such as it is presupposed by capital as its contradiction and as its contradictory being, and such as it, in turn, presupposes capital. End quote from Marx's Grundrisse. Such ontological considerations play a major role in the work of Theorie Communiste, TC, a group that emerged in the mid-70s from the discussions of the post-68 communization milieu. For TC, the communist revolution understood as communisation does not establish a republic of labor or any new form of management of the means of production. Rather, it is the overcoming of the alienated social relation of production which constitutes a separation of subjectivity and objectivity experienced in capitalism. In the overcoming of the separation of individuals from each other and from the means of production, communization overcomes the separation of human subjectivity from objectified labor, i.e., the subject-object split that forms the basis of social reality under capitalism. TC envisaged this as an overcoming of each dimension which Marx described in the Grundrisse. Labor ceases to exist as a separate activity. Production no longer distinguishes itself from and dominates reproduction. Needs are no longer separate from capacities, and individuals no longer confront their sociality through the mediation of the exchange of their products, or in the form of the state. They become directly social. The revolution as communization dissolves both the social form of things, i.e. their existence as carriers of objectified labor, of value, they become things again, and the atomized, empty, and separated out subject form of the individual. Thus for TC, as for Marx and the Grundrisse, the formerly objective moment of production no longer dominates the subjective, but rather becomes the organic social body in which the individuals reproduce themselves as individuals, but as social individuals. The German debates. The fresh appropriation of Marx, out of which the perspective of communization arose, was part of a much wider process of the reappropriation and development of radical readings of Marx. After the Hungarian Revolution of 1956, official communism no longer had hegemony on dissent and the interpretation of Marx in Western countries. While Marx had said doubt everything, orthodox or traditional Marxism tended to present itself as a unified worldview with an answer to every question. It had an all-embracing philosophy, dialectical materialism, a mechanistic view of history, historical materialism, and its own economics, Marxist political economy. These pillars of the official version of Marxism were called into question by a return to Marx's critical spirit, in much the same way that an earlier generation of critical Marxism had flowered in the immediate wake of the Russian Revolution. The revitalization of Marxian theory in this period, as in the 20s, involved a break from seeing Marxism as a positive system of knowledge and a re-recognition of its critical dimension, a move in which Marx's relation to Hegel was again in question. By the mid-60s, the rejection of received interpretations of Marx began to extend to Capital, his central work. New readings drew on earlier drafts of the Critique of Political Economy, and were interested not just in the results Marx arrived at, but also in the method he used to get there. In France, Capital was reread in a structuralist fashion. In Italy, Tronti and Operaismo took it up from the point of view of the working class, and Germany came up with a new Marx lecture, New Marx reading. The German language gave the new Marx lecture a clear advantage over investigations into Marx in other countries. The new text of the unknown Marx generally became available and known in German before any other language, and there were, of course, no issues of translation. Furthermore, the great cultural resource that Marx had used in the Critique of Political Economy, classic German idealism, was not subject to the same problems of the reception of Hegelian thought as in other countries. Thus, while in Italy and France, the new readings of Marx tended to have a strong anti-Hegel bias as a reaction against earlier fashions for Hegelianism and Hegelian Marxism, the German discussions were able to develop a more nuanced and informed picture of the Hegel-Marx connection. Crucially, they saw that in describing the logical structure of the real totality of capitalist social relations, Marx and Capital was indebted not so much to Hegel's conception of a historical dialectic, but to the systematic dialectic of the logic. The new critical Marxism, sometimes despairingly referred to as capital logic, thus had less in common with the earlier critical Marxism of Lukács and Korsch than with that of Rubin and Pashukinis. The new Marx lecture is not a homogeneous school, but a critical approach involving serious arguments and disagreements that nonetheless shared a certain direction. The political context of the German debates was the rise of a radical student movement. The movement had two poles, one traditionalist, sometimes with links to the East German state and with an orthodox Marxist orientation to the labor movement, and a stronger anti-authoritarian pole influenced by the critical theory of the Frankfurt School, particularly its psychoanalytic dimension, which offered an explanation for why workers seemed uninterested in the revolution. Due in no small part to the influence of the Frankfurt School, the German student movement quickly gained a reputation for the theoretical sophistication of its debates. The insights, but also the instability and ambivalence of the anti-authoritarian pole, were expressed in the trajectory of its charismatic leader, Rudi Dutschke. In 1966, influenced strongly by Korsch, he historicized Marx's two-stages theory of the communist revolution as anachronistic and highly questionable for us, since it postpones the real emancipation of the working class in the future and considers seizing the bourgeois state by the proletariat as being of primary importance for social revolution. Yet he also coined the slogan, Long March through the Institutions, which became the raison d'etre of the German Green Party, which he, like that other charismatic anti-authoritarian Daniel Cohn-Bennett, went on to join. Today, it is the thoroughly statist and reformist Die Linke, the leftist party in Germany, which identifies most strongly with his legacy. A more important figure theoretically was Hans-Jürgen Kroll, who also played a leading role in the SDS, especially after Dusk was shot. Krall was a student of Adorno and brought many of the key concepts of critical theory into the movement, but he was also an activist. Adorno infamously had the cops call on him and his fellow students when they occupied one of the Institute's buildings, and maintained an orientation to the proletariat and the class struggle. Although the Frankfurt School, in its turn to issues of psychoanalysis, culture, and philosophy, had largely abandoned the study of Marx's critique of political economy to the orthodox Marxists, it was Krall and other students of Adorno, Hans Georg Backhaus, Helmut Reichelt, who initiated the new Marx lecture. Thus, while for the communization milieu, it was a background in council communist and other left communist critiques of Bolshevism that made them open to the radicality of the new Marx texts, in Germany, where such tendencies had been wiped out in the Nazi period, a somewhat equivalent role was played by Adorno in the Frankfurt School. Both council communism and the Frankfurt School had developed as a reflection on the failure of the German Revolution of 1918 to 1919. While council communism's relation to the German Revolution is the more direct, Sohn Rethel, talking to the Frankfurt School, and related thinkers Lukács and Bloch, captures their more complexly mediated relation to that period with a paradoxical formulation. Quote, "The new development of thought, which these people represent, evolved as a theoretical and ideological superstructure of the revolution that never happened." End quote. Though detached from any working-class milieu, the Frankfurt School had attempted to keep alive a critical and emancipatory Marxism against its development as an apologetic ideology for state-centered accumulation in Russia. The affinity with council communism is most clearly on display in earlier texts, such as Horkheimer's Authoritarian State, which the anti-authoritarian students published to the disapproval of the rather conservative later Horkheimer. Nonetheless, a radical critique of capitalist society remains at the center of Adorno's less obviously political texts of the 50s and 60s. Indeed, perhaps even precisely due to their avoidance of the logic of immediate political effectiveness. While the ultra-left had attempted to keep alive the emancipatory promise of Marxist theory against the actual developments of labor movements by emphasizing working-class autonomy against working-class representation in institutions, the Frankfurt School had paradoxically attempted the same task by turning away from the immediate class struggle and economic questions. This meant that the radical reappropriation of Marx in 1960s Germany necessarily took the form of both a continuation and a break from the legacy of the Frankfurt School. The intersection between a sensibility informed by the Frankfurt School and a turn to the detailed study of the critique of political economy avoided by them is expressed in an anecdote of Backhaus. According to Reichelt, the origins of the program The New Marx Lecture may be traced to a moment in 1963 when Backhaus, while in student accommodation in Frankfurt, accidentally came across what was at that point a very rare first edition of Capital. He noted that the differences from the second edition immediately leapt from the page, but that this was only possible because he had heard Adorno's lectures on the dialectical theory of society, for, quote, "had not Adorno repeatedly put forward the idea of a conceptual in reality itself, of a real universal which could be traced back to the abstraction of exchange, without his questions about the constitution of the categories and their interrelation in political economy, and without his conception of an objective structure that has become autonomous, this text would have remained silent, just as it had been throughout the then already 100 years of discussion of Marxist theory of value." End quote. Debates around the new reading of Capital really got going after 1968. The issues they brought to the fore, which were generally taken up only later and often less profoundly in discussions in other languages, concerned the character of Marx's method and the validity of Engels' understanding of it, the relationship between the dialectical development of categories in Capital and Hegelian dialectics, the significance of the unfinished aspects of Marx's plan for his critique, the importance of the term critique, and the difference between Marx's theory of value and that of classical political economy, and the nature of abstraction of Marx's concept of abstract labor and the critique of political economy generally. Despite their often philological and abstract character, debates around the new reading of Capital were seen to have a political importance in the tensions between the anti-authoritarian and the traditionalist pole of the student movement, with the latter maintaining that the framework of orthodox Marxism needed only to be modernized and adjusted. The new Marx lecture challenged this project of a renewed orthodoxy through arguing for nothing less than a fundamental restructuring of the critique of political economy. At the time, the dominant view of the method at work in Capital was some variant of the logico-historical one proposed by Engels in texts such as his 1859 review of Marx's contribution to a critique of political economy, and its preface and supplement to Capital Volume 3. On this view, the progression of the categories of capital closely follows their actual historical development, such that the first few chapters of Capital are seen to describe a pre-capitalist period of simple commodity production, when the law of value was said to operate in a pure way. In the German discussions, and subsequently internationally, Engels' authority, as well as that of the traditional Marxism that depended on it, was comprehensively challenged. The new Marx lecture argued that neither Engels' interpretation nor any of the proposed modifications of it did justice to the motion behind the order and development of the categories in Capital. Rather than an advance from a non-capitalist earlier stage or a hypothetical simplified model of simple commodity production to a later stage or more complex model of capitalist commodity production, the movement in Capital was to be grasped as a presentation of the capitalist totality from the outset, moving from the abstract to the concrete. In the logical structure of Marx's concept of capital, Helmut Reichelt developed a conception which, in one form or other, is now basic to theorists of systematic dialectic, that the logic of the concept of capital as a self-determining process corresponds to the going beyond itself of the concept of Hegel's logic. According to this view, the world of capital can be seen as objectively idealist, e.g., the commodity as a sensuous, supersensuous thing. The dialectic of the value form shows how, starting with the simplest commodity form, the material and concrete aspects of the social life process are dominated by the abstract and ideal social forms of value. For Marx, as Reichelt puts it, quote, capital is thus conceived as a constant change of forms, into which use value is constantly both integrated and expelled. In this process, use value too assumes the form of an eternally vanishing object. But this constantly renewed disappearance of the object is a condition for the perpetuation of value itself. It is through the always reproduced change of forms that the immediate unity between value and use value is retained. What is thus constituted as an inverted world in which sensuousness in the widest sense, as use value, labor, exchange with nature, is demoted to a means of the self-perpetuation of an abstract process that underlies the whole objective world of constant change, the whole sensuous world of human beings who reproduce themselves through the satisfaction of needs and labor is step by step sucked into this process, in which all activities are in themselves inverted. They are all, in their vanishing appearance, immediately their own opposite, the persistence of the general. End quote. This is the ontological inversion, the possession of material life of the spirit of capital. It is what Communisation grasps in his recognition of the importance of the understanding of capital as value in process and as subsumption. If there is no use value other than in the form of value in capitalist society, if value and capital constitute a forceful, totalizing form of socialization that shapes every aspect of life, their overcoming is not a matter of the mere replacement of market mechanisms through a state manipulation or worker self-management of these forms, but demands a radical transformation of every sphere of life. By contrast, the traditional Marxist conception derived from Engels, according to which the law of value pre-existed capitalism, separate the theory of the market and value from that of surplus value and exploitation, and thus open up the possibility of ideas of a socialist law of value, a socialist form of money, market socialism, and so forth. The incomplete Marx. Part of the dogmatic nature of orthodox Marxism was to take the works of Marx to be a complete system to which only historical analyses of subsequent stages of capitalism, such as imperialism, had to be added. The discovery of the drafts and plans of the critique of political economy showed that capital was incomplete, not just in the sense that volumes 2 and 3 and theories of surplus value were left unfinished by Marx and put together by Engels and Kautsky respectively, but that these only constituted the first of a 6-book plan, alongside books on landed property, wage labor, the state, foreign trade, and the world market and crises. The recognition that what exists in Marx's project is only a fragment was of tremendous importance. as this implied seeing Marxian theory as a radically open project, and developing areas of inquiry which were barely touched upon by Marx himself. The so-called state derivation debate and the debate on the world market were attempts to develop some of these areas which Marx himself had not addressed systematically in Capital. Drawing on the pioneering work of Pashukinis, participants in the state derivation debate grasped the separation of the economic and the political as something specific to capitalist domination. The implication was that, far from establishing a socialist economy and a worker state, as in traditional Marxism, the revolution should be grasped as a destruction of both the economy and the state. Despite the abstract and at times scholastic appearance of these debates, we thus begin to see how the critical return to Marx on the basis of the struggles of the late 60s in Germany has specific and particularly radical implications for how we conceive the overcoming of the capitalist mode of production. This is equally true for the core Marxian category of abstract labor, as it is conceptualized in the German debates around value. Whereas in bourgeois social science, and in the dominant forms of Marxism, abstraction is a mental act, Marx argued that a different form of abstraction was present in capitalism, real or practical abstraction that people carry out in exchange without even knowing it. As the anecdote of Bauhaus repeated by Reichelt indicates, it was Adorno's idea of an objective conceptuality of capitalist social life that inspired the new Marx lecture approach to Marx's critique of political economy. This idea of Adorno's and his notion of identity thinking had themselves been inspired by ideas that Sohn Rethel had communicated to him in the 30s. The German discussion was thus advanced by the publication in 1970 of these ideas in Sohn Rethel's book, Intellectual and Manual Labor. In his work, Sohn Rethel identifies the abstraction from use carried out in the exchange process as at the root not only the strange kind of social synthesis and commodity societies, but of the very existence of abstract conceptual reasoning and the experience of the independent intellect. Sohn Rethel's thesis is that the transcendental subject, as explicitly theorized by Kant, is nothing else than a theoretical and at the same time blind expression of the unity or sameness of things constituted through exchange. Such ideas, along with those of Pashukinis on how the legal subject and commodity are co-produced historically, fed into a period of critical examination in which all aspects of life, including our very sense of inner subjectivity and consciousness, were grasped as form determined by capital and value. For Marx, the most striking example of real abstraction is the money form of value, and perhaps the most far-reaching contribution to the German debates lies in their development of a monetary theory of value along the lines already laid out by Rubin. In an important passage in the first edition of Capital, Marx describes money as an abstraction that perversely took on a real-world existence independently of its particulars. Quote, "It is as if, alongside and external to lions, tigers, rabbits, and all other actual animals, there existed also, in addition, the animal, the independent incarnation of the entire animal kingdom." End quote. The products of private labor must be exchanged with this concrete representation of abstract labor for the social validity to be realized in actuality. Thus, an abstraction, rather than a product of thought, exists in the world as an object with social objectivity to which all must bow. Traditional Marxism overlooked this discussion, and generally followed Ricardo and bourgeois economics in viewing money as simply a useful technical tool for facilitating the exchange of pre-existing commodity values. By contrast, the German debates picked up on the strange kind of objectivity of value, that it does not inhere in any particular commodity, but only exists in the relation of equivalence between a commodity and the totality of other commodities, something that can only be brought about through money. This role of money in a generalized commodity society feeds back onto the experience of living labor itself. To the extent that labor is simply an activity carried out from money, the kind of labor performed is a matter of indifference and chance. The organic link that existed in previous societies between particular individuals and specific forms of labor is broken. A subject able to move indifferently between different forms of labor is developed. Quote, "Here then, for the first time, the point of departure of modern economics, namely the abstraction of the category labor as such, labor pure and simple, becomes true in practice. The simplest abstraction, then, which modern economics places at the head of its discussions, and which expresses an immeasurably ancient relation valid in all forms of society, nevertheless achieves practical truth as an abstraction only as a category of the most modern society. End quote from Marx's Grundrisse. Abstract labor, then, as a practical abstraction, is a fundamentally capitalist form of labor, a product of the reduction of all activities to abstract money-generating activity. In the traditional view, the overcoming of the capitalist mode of production need not involve the abolition of abstract labor. Abstract labor, according to this view, is a generic abstraction, a general transhistorical truth underlying the appearance of market forms within the capitalist mode of production. This truth would shine forth in socialism, with the parasitic role of the capitalist eliminated, and the anarchic market organization of social labor replaced by state planning. From a critical perspective, traditional Marxism had turned capitalist forms and laws into general laws of history. In the relatively backward areas such as Russia, where Marxism became the ideology of state-led industrial development, capital became a how-to manual. By contrast, for the value form theorists, Marx's theory of value, as a monetary theory of value, is, quote, not a theory about the distribution of social wealth, but rather a theory of the constitution of the social totality under the conditions of capitalist commodity production, end quote, from Michael Heinrich. The issue is thus shifted from one of distribution to an overcoming of the form of labor, of wealth, and the mode of production itself. In different countries, sometimes in knowledge of the German discussions, but also independently, motivated by texts such as the Grundrisse and Rubin's essays, similar questions were asked, and similar answers found. For example, the importance of the value form was picked up by Althusser's then follower Jacques Rancière. Althusser had correctly identified Marx as making a complete break from the theoretical field of Ricardo and classical political economy, but was unable to identify the analysis of the value form as key to this break, because he rejected it for its Hegelianism. Rancière, however, noted that, quote, what radically distinguishes Marx from classic economic theory is the analysis of the value form of the commodity, or of the commodity form of the product of labor, end quote. This recognition was also taken up by another anti-Hegelian, Coletti, and fed into an Italian debate on value initiated by himself and Napoleoni, which came to conclusions close to those of the value form theorists. In the Anglophone discussions, where hardly anything from the German debates was translated until the late 70s, Rubin took on a primary importance. In the Conference of Socialist Economists, a central forum for these debates, a major argument was that between a Rubin-inspired abstract social labor theory of value and a more traditionalist embodied labor theory of value. Those in the former camp moved in the direction of a monetary theory of value, as in the German debates, but there was far less discussion of and appreciation of the relevance of Hegel's logic for understanding the systematic relation of the categories in capital. In the absence of a translation of Reichelt and Bauhaus, the Anglophone few who follow the Germans in wishing to reconstruct capital, the Constant Sydney School, identified as a value form school, were seen by most other participants as overly extreme. It is a feature of systematic dialectic, as it has emerged recently, that such suggestions of a need for a more radical reconstruction are now at the core of the discussion. The anti-politics of value theory. The critical import of value form theory is that it calls into question any political conception based on the affirmation of the proletariat as producer of value. It recognizes Marx's work as an essentially negative critique of capitalist society. In reconstructing the Marxian dialectic of the value form, it demonstrates how the social life process is subsumed under, or form determined by, the value form. What characterizes such form determination is a perverse priority of the form over its content. Labor does not simply pre-exist as objectification on the capitalist commodity as a positive ground to be liberated in socialism or communism through the alteration of its formal expression. Rather, in a fundamental sense, value, as a primary social mediation, pre-exists and thus is a priority over labor. As Chris Arthur argues, quote, at the deepest level, The failure of the tradition that uses the model of simple commodity production is that it focuses on the human individual as the originator of value relationships, rather than viewing human activities as objectively inscribed within the value form. In truth, however, the law of value is imposed on people through the effectivity of a system with capital at its heart. Capital that subordinates commodity production is the aim of valorization, and it is a real subject, identified as such by Marx, confronting us. End quote. While it seems true and politically effective to say that we produce capital by our labor, it is actually more accurate to say, in a world that is really topsy-turvy, that we, as subjects of labor, are produced by capital. Socially necessary labor time is a measure of value only because the value form posits labor as its content. In a society no longer dominated by alienated social forms, no longer orientated around the self-expansion of abstract wealth, the compulsion to labor which characterizes the capitalist mode of production will disappear. With value, abstract labor disappears as a category. The reproduction of individuals and their needs becomes an end in itself. Without the categories of value, abstract labor, and the wage, labor would cease to have a systematic role as determined by the primary social mediation, value. This is why value form theory points, in terms of the notion of revolution that follows from it, in the same direction as communization. The overcoming of capitalist social relations cannot involve a simple liberation of labor. Rather, the only way out is a suppression of value itself, of the value form which posits abstract labor as a measure of wealth. Communization is the destruction of the commodity form and the simultaneous establishment of immediate social relations between individuals. Value, understood as a total form of social mediation, cannot be got rid of by halves. The fact that few value form theorists have explicitly drawn such radical political conclusions from their work is neither here nor there. Such radical political or anti-political conclusions are for us the logical implications of the analysis. A return to Marx. Value form theory's recognition of the hidden kernel of Marx's critique of political economy would suggest that already in 1867, Marx had grasped value as a totalizing form of social mediation, which had to be overcome as a whole. Thus, Marxism, with its history of affirmation of labor and identification with state-led socialist accumulation, could be seen as a history of the misinterpretation of Marx. The correct reading, which points towards a radical negation of value, has on this view somehow been missed. However, if Marx's theory of the value form implied communization in the modern sense, then it was an implication that he clearly missed himself. Indeed, Marx's own attitude towards the importance of his value theory was ambivalent. On the one hand, Marx insisted on its scientific importance, but in response to the difficulties his readers had in grasping its subtleties, he seemed willing to compromise over it for the benefit of the reception of the rest of his work. As well as being willing to popularize his work and hide his method, he allowed Engels, who, as we have seen, was one of the people who had difficulty with this aspect of his friend's work, to write various reviews which downplayed the treatment of value and money so it wouldn't detract from the main topic. It seems Marx had the position that, quote, the value theory is a logical prerequisite of his theory of capitalist production, but is not indispensable for understanding what this latter theory means, and especially what the critique is of capitalist production. The Marxist discussion in recent years has adopted this apparent Marxian attitude. In every way, by setting up the problem of whether the Marxian value theory is necessary for the Marxian theory of class exploitation. End quote from Michael Eldred. Marx seemed to accept that a more or less left Ricardian reading of his work would be adequate for the needs of the workers' movement. His political writings assumed that a powerful working class, rallying around an increasingly homogeneous workers' identity, would through its unions and its parties simply extend its day-to-day struggles into a revolutionary overthrow of capitalist society. Against the Lassallean social democratic Marxism of his day, Marx did write the scathing critique of the Gotha program, in which he strongly attacked its labor-affirming and incoherent political economic assumptions. However, he didn't feel it necessary to publish it. Moreover, the ideas he put forward even in the critique, which was later published by Engels, are by no means unproblematic. They include a theory of transition in which bourgeois right and distribution would still prevail, through the use of labor notes, and in which his description of the first stage of socialism is far closer to capitalism than it is to the more attractive second stage, with no mechanism given to explain how the one can change into the other. It would be wrong to suggest that the German discussions ignored the disjunction between the radical stance that many of them were deriving or developing from Marx's critique and Marx's own politics. In the late 70s, an important way in which this issue began to be understood was in terms of a difference between an esoteric Marx with a radical critique of value as a form of totalizing social mediation, and an exoteric Marx with an orientation to and support for the aims of the workers' movement of his time. The exoteric Marx was taken to be based on a misreading of the 19th century proletariat's radical potential. One strong tendency in the German context became to jettison the exoteric Marx in favor of the esoteric Marx. Marx's idea of capital as an unconscious automatic subject was seen to displace the idea, which he also seems to have had, of the proletariat as a subject of history. Class struggle is not denied on this view, but seen as system immanent, moving within the categories, and the abolition of the categories is looked for elsewhere. Marx in this view was simply wrong to identify with the workers' movement, which hindsight has shown us was a movement for emancipation within capitalist society, and not the movement to abolish that society. This tendency is exemplified by the value critique groups Crisis and Exit. Though he does not use the esoteric-exoteric distinction, Moshe Postone, who developed his ideas in Frankfurt in the early 70s, essentially argues for the same kind of position. In Time, Labor, and Social Domination, he sees Marx as offering a critique of labor and capitalism, the esoteric Marx, rather than, as in traditional Marxism, a critique from the point of view of labor, the exoteric Marx. It is interesting that apart from this turn away from class, Postone is more explicit than most academic value form Marxists in drawing conclusions from his theory which in political terms put him on the ultra-left, or even resonate with the communization thesis. By no means all those influenced by the new Marx reading, and certainly not all those within the broader area of a critical value form-oriented Marxism, take this turn away from the class struggle. In Anglophone discussions, the adoption of a monetary or abstract social labor theory of value has in general not involved the same rejection of class analysis. But then, it has also not involved the same critique of traditional leftist assumptions that emerged in Germany. Werner Bonefeld, however, who has done more than most to introduce critical conceptions derived from the German discussions into Anglophone Marxism, does take a resolutely pro-class struggle perspective. Nonetheless, most accounts of the new Marx lecture understand one of its main characteristics to be a rejection of Marx's attribution of an historical mission to the proletariat, and a sensibility of skepticism towards the class struggle has been prevalent on the German left. But if in this type of view the proletariat is rejected as an agency of revolution, then the question becomes, of course, where will the abolition of class society come from? The somewhat unsatisfactory answer prevalent in various forms in German discussions seems to be that it is a matter of having the right critique. That is, in seeing the revolution as a matter of acquiring the correct consciousness. In this focus on correct consciousness and critique, it seems that, ironically, for all the questioning of traditional Marxism, a certain Leninist problematic separating educator and educated is retained. We have emphasized the way in which the new Marx lecture marked a development from and improvement on the Frankfurt School. Adorno's dialectical theory of society, in terms of a systemic self-reproduction behind the backs of individuals, of the inversion of subject-object, and the existence of real abstraction, derived from Marx's critique of political economy. However, Adorno did not himself conduct a detailed study of capital and its drafts, relying to a great extent on others' research. The new Marx lecture demonstrated the correctness of Adorno's understanding of capitalist society not in the general area of philosophy and social theory, but on the traditional Marxism's chosen terrain of the interpretation of capital. Yet Adorno and Horkheimer seemed unable to follow the theoretical developments being made by their students. After their death, the legacy of the Frankfurt School suffered a complete degeneration into bourgeois theory under Habermas, while the new Marx lecture fed into a flourishing of critical Marxian theory. Nonetheless, there is a way that the achievements of the new Marx lecture can be seen to fall beneath Adorno. The category of class plays little role in the writings of Bauhaus and Reichelt, and they treat the question of revolution as outside their field of academic expertise. And thus, it is ironically Adorno, even with his idea of the integration of the proletariat, who has more to say on these subjects. Antagonism as a concept features prominently in his writings, and is met in a very orthodox sense of class antagonism. In essays such as Society, 1965, Remarks on Social Conflict Today, 1968, and Late Capitalism or Industrial Society, 1968, Adorno reveals an orthodox, in a good sense, concern for the reality of class antagonism and exploitation. In Remarks, written with Ursula Jerisk, he attacks the notion of social conflict as a positivistic flattening of Marx's concept of class struggle, though one objectively made possible by the development of class society, integration. Though not being fought out consciously, class antagonism is still at the very heart of contemporary society, according to Adorno. This is brought out in the notes to a lecture by Adorno that Bauhaus acknowledges as inspiring the new Marx lecture. Adorno repeatedly stresses here that the exchange relation is preformed by the class relation. The only reason why the worker accepts given relations is that he has nothing but his labor power to sell. Unlike in Bauhaus's own writings, Adorno's focus is very much on the fact that while exchange is no mere illusion but real, it is in the concept of surplus value that the semblance of the process of exchange is to be found. Thus, while Bauhaus and Reichelt delve much deeper into Marx's writings, in a certain sense, Adorno was less academic, more political, and closer to Marx's concern with exploitation and class antagonism. In this respect, too, Kroll was totally different from his inheritors. As the full title of his posthumously published writings indicates, Kroll had the merit not only of being interested in the mediation of value categories and class struggle, but also of taking an eminently historical perspective, one which is largely missing from the essentially philological works of Reichelt and Bauhaus. After Kroll, a concern for systemic reconstruction displaces all concern for history in the new Marx lecture. The move of Bauhaus, Reichelt, and the next generation of value theorists like Heinrich has been to expel from Marx's work everything that smells of an unscientific philosophy of history or theory of revolution. The issue is not to seek out some kind of mechanical application of the theory, but to recognize that the problems that Adorno and Kroll gave different answers to have not gone away. System must be grasped historically, and history systematically. As opposed to any simplistic return to the position of Adorno, or for that matter, the untranslated writings of Kroll, the point is to grasp Adorno's pessimistic attitude to the possibilities of class struggle of his day, and as an attempt at an honest facing up to the contradictions and impasses of his period, rather than a mere failing on his part. Similarly, the retreat from the questions of Kroll, the skepticism in German discussions about class struggle Marxism, and the attempt to ground a revolutionary theory in some other way are not mere ideological aberrations. If they have not seemed to arrive at a convincing alternative, they have at least identified a real problem. It is not obvious from the historical record that the workers' movement points in the direction of communism understood as the end of value, class, the state, etc. Indeed, quite the reverse. The argument that class struggle is system immanent captures the trapped character of struggles within capital. The idea of the esoteric and exoteric Marx, the wish to decouple Marxian critique from the class struggle, appears, no matter how heretical, to offer a plausible solution to the problem of the failure of the working class to perform its historic task. Through the idea that the workers' movement was never really revolutionary in itself, and that the really revolutionary perspective lay simply in Marx's esoteric vision. Yet, of course, such a decoupling would leave us with no plausible alternative scenario for the realization of this vision. It is clear that the theory of value and class analysis cannot ultimately be separated. The categories of value and class are mutually implicated. By understanding capital as operating in terms of a systemic dialectic, one can see that their relation is an internal one, both that the positing of social labor in the form of the contradiction of capital and wage labor is the ultimate development of the value relation, and that value relations are a product of the separation of living labor from objectified labor, that is, of class. But although it must therefore be ultimately futile to look for the abolition of value anywhere else than towards a class that is forced to produce it, and which is increasingly made redundant by it, the doubts about the revolutionary potential of the working class that are harbored by many of the value critics have to be confronted. It seems to us that theory communists do this. At the heart of TC's theory is the recognition of the reciprocal implication or mutual involvement of proletariat and capital. The fundamental problem that follows from this is how the struggle of a class that is a class of capitalist society can abolish that society. Part of the importance of the contribution of TC is to have resisted answering this by attributing a revolutionary human essence to the proletariat, beneath its merely class and capitalist nature, while at the same time not losing the centrality of the class contradiction. Their answer is rather to grasp a class relation, while always involving a systematic implication, as developing historically through cycles of struggle. Crucially for TC, communization is not what communism and the revolution always really was, or as it always should have been. Rather, the concept of communization emerges historically with the end of a cycle of struggle in which communism and revolution appeared as something else. For TC, the classical workers' movement from Marx through the Second and Third Internationals was part of a cycle of struggle, which they term programmatism. In this period, workers' struggles and the vision of the overcoming of capitalism that emerged from them was based on an autonomy and positivity that workers were able to maintain within the capital-labor relation. The revolution of this period could be described as the impossible attempt to abolish a relation by affirming one of its poles. The tragedies of social democracy and Stalinism and anarchism's experience in Spain were the product of the contradictions of the goal and methods set by the movement in its high period, which in turn were a product of the configuration of the class relation at that time, i.e., of the way that capital and class confronted each other. Francois Denal sums up the situation in the following passage. Quote, "Since the development of the capitalist relation, that is to say of the struggle of its classes, did not immediately bring the abolition but the generalization of wage labor, the proletariat abstracted in the final goal from the movement and made the revolution, its seizure of power, depend on the maturation of conditions, both objective, the development of productive forces, and subjective, its will and its class consciousness. It thus posed communism as a program, and its full achievement as the ultimate term of an impossible transition. The proletarian repossession and mastery of the movement of value, wage labor, supposedly withering away from the moment that one replaced money with a labor note. What the workers' movement thus called into question was not capital as a mode of production, but only the management of production by the bourgeoisie. It was either a question of the workers seizing the productive apparatus from this parasitic class and of destroying its state in order to rebuild another, led by the party as a bearer of consciousness, or else of undermining the power of the bourgeois state by organizing production themselves from the bottom up through the organ of the trade unions or councils. But there was never a question or attempt of abolishing the law of value, the compulsion towards accumulation, and thus towards the reproduction of exploitation, which materializes itself at the same time in machinery, in fixed capital as capital in itself, and in the necessary existence, facing the working class, of an exploiting class, bourgeois or bureaucratic, as the collective agent of that reproduction." End quote. The determinate failure of this programmatic revolution bequeathed a post-World War II capitalism where the workers' movement had a certain power within capitalist society, but no longer carried its earlier aspect of autonomous revolutionary affirmation. It was this situation that the development of a revolutionary theory had to confront. The struggles which then gave rise to new theoretical production in the 60s and 70s were, whatever the hopes of groups like the SI, not beyond programmatism. Rather, they took on a contradictory character: countercultural utopianism and resistance to work, issues of everyday life, coinciding with, and in many ways depending upon, the strength of a more programmatic movement. It was in this contradiction and these struggles that the theory of communization and the new critical Marxism could arise. The resolution of these struggles in capital's favor marked the end of that cycle and a restructuring in which the class's possibilities of a positive autonomy and affirmation within capitalism would be suppressed. It is for TC exactly this defeat that creates a new configuration of the class relation in which the existence of the class is no longer experienced as a positivity to affirm, but as an external constraint in the form of capital. And it is this configuration which necessitates both a new understanding of communism and a new reading of Marx. It is possible to interpret this return to Marx in terms of an ebb and flow of communist theory to parallel that of revolutionary waves, 1917, 1968, etc. But, just as the perspective of communization did not emerge, even in the marginal heretical tendencies of the earlier revolutionary period, neither did earlier critical Marxisms go as far as those that emerged from the 60s. Lukács, Rubin, and Pušakinas developed their conceptions in relation to ascendant workers' movement, expressing a certain configuration of the capital-labor relation. The work of the earlier critical Marxists, as well as that of Marx, the first value form theorist, had contradictions and limitations which the later generation, writing as programmatism was coming to an end, were able to go beyond. In the earlier period, while the affirmative proletarian project of programmatism was necessarily a failure, not only from our perspective of communization, but even, and this is important, in terms of the goals it set itself, it nevertheless gave the contradiction of capital and labor room to move. By the late 60s, that room was being exhausted. For the theorists of the second revolutionary wave of the 20th century, one issue that was plainly at stake was a rejection of the idea and practice of socialism as that of workers receiving the true value of their labor in a planned economy. The critical reading of Marx grasped the radicality of what the revolutionary negation of value involves. We are speaking as much of the overcoming of our own selves as of something out there. The contribution of TC is to grasp how and why the configuration of the contradiction between capital and labor in an earlier period did not pose such an overcoming. In Marx's day, and during the historical workers' movement, the relation of capital and proletariat posed revolution in terms of the affirmation rather than the negation of labor, value, and class. The work of TC suggests that the radical way out, implied by value form theory, may be determined by the historical evolution of the capital-labor relation itself, rather than being the product of an ahistorically correct consciousness, free-floating scientific point of view, or perspective of critique. The historical perspective on the class relation complements value form theory, and the sophisticated analysis of capitalist social relations and systematic dialectic in value form theory can inform the perspective of communization by offering an elaboration of what exactly this class relation is, and how the particular social relation of capitalist society are form determined as such. Systematic dialectic and value form theory can help us understand the character of the capitalist class relation, i.e., what it is exactly that can have a history in which revolution previously presented itself in the form of programmatism, and whose adequate horizon of supersession is now communization. Communism necessitates the abolition of a multifaceted relation that has evolved over time, but to abolish it simply means that we cease to constitute value, and it ceases to constitute us. The radicality of our own period is that this is now the only way we can conceive it.